On Monday, China launched its second largest incursion into Taiwan's air defense zone. They sent 30 jets into the area, including 20 fighters. For what that portends, we are joined by author, columnist, and expert on Asian affairs, Chang. Gordon, tell me what China's latest incursion into that Taiwanian airspace tells you. This happened on Monday. So far this year, Taiwan has reported 465 incursions by China, a 50% increase from this period last year. What are they looking to do here?
Well, China wants to intimidate Taiwan, and they also want to intimidate the United States. You know, we saw this last week when China did something even worse. With Russia, it flew nuclear-capable bombers around Tokyo while President Biden and other leaders were having their meetings. And so China at this point is not trying to persuade anybody, it's just trying to force them into compliance.
Wow. During his trip to Asia last week, Biden said the U.S. would respond militarily if China attacked Taiwan, something no other president has ever said. Listen.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made. We support the one China policy. We support all that we've done in the past. But that does not mean that China has the ability, the jurisdiction to go in and use force to take over Taiwan.
Now, responding to Biden's comments, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said the Chinese side expresses strong dissatisfaction with and resolute opposition to relevant words of the U.S. Now, the White House ended up walking back those relevant words, Gordon. But what was the impact of the Biden moment on U.S.-China relations?
That's a great question. I think that what it showed to Beijing was that it could intimidate Biden because after those words from the foreign ministry, Biden actually walked back his comments. And as you point out, the general trend of Biden administration policy with regard to Taiwan has actually been quite good. There are more and more contacts, especially on the military level. But nonetheless, when it comes to the president himself, he's creating this disarray. And I think that Beijing looks at that and maybe believes that it could do something because Biden would not be in a position to oppose them.
Now, according to several reports, China and the U.S. are working to finalize what could be the first face-to-face meeting between the Chinese defense minister and the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd at some annual defense conference in Singapore. Now, this happens as these Taiwan tensions increase. Should this meeting take place later this month, what do you expect to come of it, if anything?
I don't really expect too much to come of it. I think Lloyd Austin might say the U.S. will defend Taiwan, and they'll say that quietly, and the Chinese will scream and shout. But I actually think that this meeting is not a good idea. For decades, we have chased the Chinese to talk, and that has swollen their already inflated sense of self-importance. And over this period, China's become more aggressive and provocative. So our policies are obviously not working. I think that we should give the Chinese an incentive to come running to us and to beg to talk. So I don't like this idea of Lloyd Austin talking to his Chinese counterpart.
I want to move on to China's interest in the Pacific Islands. This is really troubling when I saw it earlier this week. On Monday, China fell short of a bold plan to have 10 Pacific nations endorse a sweeping new agreement that would cover everything from security issues to fisheries. David Panuelo, the president of the Federated States of Micronesia, told other Pacific leaders that he would not endorse the plan, calling it, quote, the single most game-changing proposed agreement in the Pacific in any of our lifetimes, and it threatens to bring a new Cold War era at best and a World War at worst. Gordon, this agreement was basically designed for these islands to hand over control of parts of their security and economy to China. What is China attempting to do here besides destabilizing the region?
Well, they have a plan to rule the world. I mean, they've been very clear that they believe that they're the world's only sovereign state. So obviously they should rule the Pacific. What they did here was overreach. I mean, they were successful in getting a security agreement in the Solomon Islands, which is a game changer. But then they thought that they could dominate the entire Pacific, and there they fell short.
Yeah, I want to put up a map of the Pacific Island nations China is targeting. The ones in red were visited by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi as he pushed this multilateral agreement. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, every island can get up to 200 nautical miles off its coasts as an exclusive economic zone in which it controls resources like fisheries. China may not have gotten the 10 island nations to sign on to its plan, but they did manage, as you mentioned, to sign smaller bilateral agreements with other Pacific nations. For example, Kiribati signed some economic agreements and they agreed to build some bridge. Kiribati has key fishing grounds the size of California. How dangerous is it for these small islands to be making these agreements with China? And how could these agreements affect all those surrounding countries, including the United States' interests?
Well, I'm very glad, Raymond, that you talked about Kiribati, because Kiribati is 1,900 miles south of Hawaii. But in Pacific terms, it actually is our next door neighbor. And there, China wants to improve an airstrip, which means that the Chinese Air Force could have facilities that could attack Hawaii. So this is extremely dangerous. You know, the story here, Raymond, I can understand Chinese assertion, but what we shouldn't understand and we shouldn't forgive is that American policy over the course of decades was either neglectful or arrogant. And in those cases where we actually had a policy, it was misguided. So the Chinese are just taking advantage of a situation that we ourselves created.
China, they offer economic incentives and infrastructure to, they've done this throughout Europe. Now they're doing it to these island nations. We've seen them work the same routine in African countries. The Prime Minister of Fiji had this to say during a press conference on Monday. Listen.
Our meeting today was guided by mutual respect and the common interest of our people's continued socio-economic progress. We have a solid foundation on which to build. Fiji's friendship with China has helped develop infrastructure, train our people, and deliver essential medical supplies, which accelerated our post-pandemic recovery.
Gordon, what should nearby nations, namely Australia and New Zealand, be doing to counter China's aggression here? What about the U.S.?
Well, first of all, the U.S. should not subcontract our policy out to New Zealand and Australia, because over the course of decades, the policies of those two countries have really been malign in some of these islands, which is the reason why China is making such fast progress. The United States needs to start paying attention. So, for instance, we're reopening an embassy in the Solomon Islands, which is, should never have been closed in the first place. So this is really a problem in Washington that we just need to understand how important the Pacific is, because it is right next door to us.
Yeah, and Gordon, people forget these Pacific Islands are predominantly Christian, and opposition to China, the Solomon Islands security deal, for instance, has come from church groups, women's groups, and provincial leaders. But church leaders are noting that China has stamped out religious freedom in their own country. How important is religion to the people in these Pacific Islands, and what influence might that have on this relationship going forward?
I think religion is one of the bulwarks that we have in terms of opposing China's ambitions here. When China comes into these islands, Raymond, one of the things it does is it corrupts the political system and it corrupts business elites. And of course, their ultimate goal is to eliminate religion. We have seen this not only in China, but now it's occurring in Hong Kong with the jailing of Cardinal Zen. This is an attempt to, enforce their view of the world. They're atheists, and they believe religion is their enemy. So this is something that we can do to mobilize people throughout the region, because as you point out, this is a deeply religious part of the world.
Lastly, China has remarkably called on the United Nations human rights chief to investigate mass shootings in the U.S. in an effort to hit back at the United States, which, along with lawmakers of other countries, has accused China of genocide in Xinjiang. Your thoughts on this turnabout?
Well, the UN human rights process has been thoroughly corrupted by China. And we saw this with the High Commissioner's visit, Michelle Bachelet, 2 days to Xinjiang, 6 or so, 7 days on the rest of her trip. the rest of it in quarantine. She whitewashed what was occurring there. She was propagating China's narratives on human rights. This was a debacle. And it really makes us think about our participation in the United Nations human rights process in particular, and in the United Nations in general.
Good point. Gordon Chang, thank you for the insight. And you can visit gordonchang.com for Gordon's latest insights on China, North Korea, and much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond.